Due to the themes of this podcast, listener discretion is advised.
So this anti-Western axis is fighting the West on the territory of Ukraine and Israel.
Lock your doors, close the blinds, change your passwords. This is Secrets and Spies. Secrets and Spies is a podcast that dives into the world of espionage, terrorism, geopolitics, and intrigue. This podcast is produced and hosted by Chris Carr.
On today's podcast, I'm joined by Dr Taras Kuzio, and we discuss Russia's war in Ukraine and all the latest developments there. And we also talk about the anti-Western axis that is at war with the West. I hope you find this episode interesting. Thank you for listening.
The opinions expressed by guests on Secrets and Spies do not necessarily represent those of the producers and sponsors of this podcast.
Dr Taras Kuzio, welcome back to the podcast. How are you?
Thank you for inviting me. I'm doing okay. I mean, it's we're going into the winter of the second year of the war, so a lot of mixed feelings.
Yeah. For those who are unfamiliar with you and your work, please can you just tell us a little bit about yourself?
I've been covering the Soviet Union first in the 80s, and then since 1991, the former Soviet Union, primarily Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, for now going on more than 30 years. I'm especially interested in things like nationalism, identity, ethnic conflict, democratization, those kind of things, as opposed to hardcore international relations. But obviously, all of these questions are often interlinked, like especially in the case of Russia's nationalism influencing its foreign policy and military policy. I've written and edited quite a few books since 2014. Vladimir Putin has not allowed me to put my feet up, as it were. Written about the crisis in 2014, the Russian first invasion, the annexation of Crimea, and then issues connecting, dealing with hybrid warfare. I'm also, and I've just there's coming out soon an edited collection, quite a large volume, about the influence of Russian information and policy and disinformation. And a lot of these, anybody who listens to your podcast will know, a lot of this has its origins in the Soviet Union. Then it was desinformatia, and so a lot of this, hybrid warfare. Then it was called active measures and issues like that. But the disinformation aspect is very interesting because of its impact. I find it interesting for its impact on Western journalists and Western academics. How Russian propaganda topics, like, for example, what's going on in Ukraine is Nazis coming to power, civil war, repression of Russian speakers. Basically, Kremlin talking points get repeated by people in the West. These can be called useful idiots. Some maybe are outright agents, but that you'd be surprised how that is continually coming to influence, particularly because we seem to live in a world of conspiracy theorizing, with social media and things like that, and Russia keeps pumping out these conspiracy theories, which then get regurgitated in the West.
Yeah,
there has been a distinct, and for me, it's fascinating, even watching Britain with the likes of Jeremy Corbyn on the far left and his academic friends. There has been a kind of, today, if you're a Russophile or a Kremlinophile, you have to kind of camouflage it. In 2014, you didn't do that. You just openly were pro-Russian and anti-American, blaming NATO and the US. Today, you can't really do that because of Russian war crimes, illegal invasion, etc. And so you have to pretend you're a peacemaker. You have so you propose things like territory for peace. Let's stop the bloodshed. Let's freeze the lines. and which basically gives this territory to Russia. It benefits Russia, it rewards Russia, but they indirectly are able to promote their pro-Russian views. So I follow that area very very much as well, but certainly it's more and more the case, and I think this is an area that many Western kind of specialists, journalists, academics find difficult to look at, is the whole question of national identity fueling this war. We can talk about that and how that pumps into the anti-Western axis of evil, but I think it's difficult for us living in the 21st century to get our heads around somebody like Putin who lives in the 19th century. It's like, hold on, this discourse that he's coming out with is a bit outdated. But yeah, I mean, that's the era he lives in. And we have to deal with that.
Yeah, it's interesting that. I mean, I think there's still many people who are living in that kind of late 90s post-history kind of mindset, and I think some people are finding it difficult to adjust to the idea that nationalism and religion are still dominant forces in sort of world politics today.
Yes, they are. I mean, just look at India, look at China. It's not just Russia. Many parts of the world, that's certainly true. I mean, in 1991, it was not obviously the end of history. We'll talk about it, but what we have now is a war declared against the West by an anti-Western axis of evil, and so there are countries in the world who refuse to accept 1991 was the end of history, i.e., the victory of Western liberal democracy. They refuse, and the two places where they are fighting against the West are Israel and Ukraine. These two countries, in the eyes of Iran and Russia, respectively, should be wiped from the face of the earth.
Yeah, and maybe just leading in on what you've just been discussing there, it's a bit off topic a little bit, but maybe it is on topic. You may or may not have insight on this. I'm sure you do. I'm fascinated by how Russian propaganda is affecting academia today, because with the terrible 7th of October attacks, we had a lot of young students sort of going out and ending up sort of supporting Hamas and saying Hamas are just victims of oppression and then they're a sort of justified force against Israel. And something just struck me. Something's gone terribly wrong in academia that's led to people kind of believing that. And I can't get my head around it. And I'm trying to work out where this has sort of come from.
Well, I think you're right to point to this. I think that we're back to the issue of camouflage anti-Semitism, which we always had on the sort of the far left of political parties, not only Britain, elsewhere in Europe. The origins of this are really the anti-Zionist campaigns that the Soviet Union undertook in the sort of late 60s, 70s, and early 80s, where the KGB was actually training all these various different Palestinian groups.
Yeah.
For me, what is particularly indicative is that there's if you are only concerned with, and it's a good concern, if you're concerned with human rights and the human rights of Palestinians, fair enough. But actually, it's not the Israelis who are killing most Muslims in the world. It's the Russians and Chinese. And where are the protests against China locking up 1 million Muslims? I've not heard of a single protest.
Yeah.
And this is also hypocritical on the part of Islamic states who still want to deal with China and ignore that. Syria, that regime in Syria, which is backed by Russia, has murdered over 500,000 Sunni Muslims. Where are the protests of these students? Far more of those have died than Palestinians at the hands of Israelis. But so it makes me very suspicious that there's an underlying sort of this anti-Zionism a la Jeremy Corbyn is a kind of a camouflage anti-Semitism. Because if they were protesting about all of this human rights problems with, Syria, China, Palestine, then fair enough. But they're not. They're not. It's just Israel is their point of hatred. So there's something not quite right here. It makes me, my antennae go up straight away.
Yeah, mine have too, and I'm trying to calibrate my antennae a little bit at the moment, trying to work out what's going on and where it's sort of coming from. And
I think it's one of these. It's a trendy thing, With students, it's always trendiness, and it's trendy to be Palestinian, to wear the headscarf and the Palestinian the headpiece, and such like. And I think it's partly that. It used to be trendy with many American and other actors to be pro-Tibetan. Remember back 10, 20 years ago, that's all been forgotten about now, even though the Chinese are committing genocide against the Tibetans. So I think it's partly that, students jump on a bandwagon, it's trendy, and then probably in about 5 years' time, they'll forget about it as well. When I was a student, it was trendy to be anti-South Africa, anti-apartheid regime. So I think these things go up and down, to be honest.
Yes, indeed. Well, let's move on to Ukraine, because that's sort of the key area I wanted to chat about today, because I feel like with the Israel-Palestine situation, Ukraine's sort of slightly been pushed out of the media, and I think it's important that it stays in the media. So there's been a lot of talk in the Western press about Ukraine's counteroffensive not being as effective or fast enough for some people, and that there's a sort of stalemate between Russia and Ukraine, yet Russia is still bombing Ukrainian cities. So I was wondering if you can give us a kind of brief update on the current situation in Ukraine, which is quite a big question, so I apologize.
Yeah, it is a big question. I mean, firstly, when we talk about counteroffensives, I mean, we shouldn't just limit ourselves to the military component in the southeast of Ukraine. There's a whole range of activities which are continuing, including in wintertime. I mean, just this morning, there was a report of a long-range Ukrainian missile striking the Trans-Siberian Railway near the Chinese border.
Oh, wow.
I mean, that's one hell of a distance.
That is.
Because, I mean, what everybody tends to forget as well is that Ukraine had a massive military-industrial complex in the Soviet Union, which went, into decline after 1991, but which has now been revived again. So Ukraine has the IT and the technical and other knowledge to build that kind of kit. And you can see that with the innovative different aspects of what Ukraine's doing in the war. So the drones, the missiles, the attacks on Crimea, the building of a bridgehead on it's on the eastern side of the river Dnipro, which is sort of southwest Kherson region. So if you're looking at southeast Ukraine, it's over that way. It's a way to kind of surround the Russian forces in the southeast. Assassination attempts, various sort of blowing up of collaborators, Russian officers. All of that's going on. So we should be looking at it as a whole, as opposed to just the actual military component. The military component itself has gone slower than expected. And what is bizarre about the criticism is that Western governments, particularly the Germans and the Americans, didn't give the Ukraine the kit that they should have very quickly. I mean, the key moment when this war would have been over if Western countries, especially the US and Germany, had given Ukraine the military equipment after the rout of Russian forces in Kharkiv, which was in September 2022. Russian forces ran literally with their trousers around their ankles away from the battlefield. It was a complete rout of the Russian forces. If then they'd have flown in, brought in all this equipment, which they gave over the next 1 or 2 years, if they'd given it then, Russian army would have been defeated in Ukraine. The war would have been over. But they didn't. So it took forever for stuff to arrive in Ukraine. And that allowed, in particular, the Russians about 8 to 9 months to build up 3 lines of fortifications and lay tens of thousands, 100,000. It's difficult. Ukraine is the most mined country in the world. Allowed the Russians to basically prepare for the offensive. And then the West hardly sent any demining equipment, the jets still haven't arrived.
Yeah.
That took forever to debate in the West. And as Western military experts will say, if a Western army or NATO army goes into battle, it has to have air superiority. Ukrainians don't have that because they don't have the jets yet. So Ukraine was handicapped from the start by, the Russians been allowed so much time to build up their fortifications and demining and not being given the equipment. And my one of my main arguments is because you've got countries like Germany. Germany's kind of changed a bit now, but certainly the Biden administration, which wants Ukraine to not. The Biden administration's goals are to not have Ukraine be defeated, but it doesn't have the goal of defeating the Russian military. And that's the key difference between the British, for example, the British, the Scandinavians, the Poles, the Balts, the Czechs. They all openly say, the British government always openly says, our goal is Russia's military defeat.
Yeah.
The Biden administration has never said that. And because it doesn't have that goal of Russia's military defeat, it's drip-fed military equipment to Ukraine. And it still denies stuff like, for example, the ATACMS. The only ones that supplied to Ukraine were the ones that could fire cluster munitions, not the ones that could do medium-range missile attacks. And the arguments why that is because the Biden administration is very cautious, it's afraid of maybe Russia moving to nuclear escalation, of other things such as Russian military defeat leading to the disintegration of the Russian Federation, chaos, this kind of thing. It reminds me very much, and I certainly remember this, of the same discussions back in 1990-91, when the USSR was it was moving towards this integration. And George Bush Sr., then the US president, came to Kyiv in July of 1991 and gave what was nicknamed his Chicken Kyiv speech, where he told the Ukrainian parliament, you should not aim for independence. Because what they were afraid of, the US was fighting the Soviet Union for decades through the CIA, covert and other means. And then when the USSR was about to disintegrate, they went, oh my God, this is going to be a nuclear Yugoslavia. And so, of course, the Ukrainians ignored George Bush's comments in Kyiv because they declared independence the month after.
Yeah.
But it's the same kind of rationale with the Biden team now. And that drip approach means that they are kind of in this middle ground between a more British hawkish approach, which is give the Ukrainians everything they need, and then we'll defeat the Russians. And then the other extreme would be, no, stop the war, just trade land for peace, as it were. But the Biden administration's in the middle, and it keeps getting criticized for not really having the goal. So the Republicans in the US, I think, do have a point. Even the populists, the Trumpite populists, they do have a point when they say the Biden administration has never outlined what its end goal is. The British have outlined it, the Scandinavians, the Poles, they've outlined it. Ukraine's military victory, Russia's military defeat. The Biden administration only goes for the Ukrainian side, not the Russian side. And that leads to a kind of a wishy-washy foreign policy towards this conflict. And it means that Ukrainians are going to be suffering a very long, drawn-out war now. Yeah. Instead of the war ending very quickly by end of 2023, it's now going to drag on for years. It means higher Ukrainian military and civilian casualties and more destruction, more casualties on the Russian side as well, as opposed to the war ending, I think, very quickly, which it could have done if the Russians weren't allowed to settle in and build those fortifications.
Yeah. Couple of sub-questions. What is the sort of situation at the moment in the Black Sea and Crimea?
Well, this is going to be something that military historians are going to be writing about for decades or years to come.
Wow.
How a country without a navy could destroy another country's navy.
Yeah.
The Russian Black Sea Fleet now is a non-entity. I mean, it's not a military entity anymore. It's had to move most of its best ships out of Sevastopol towards Novorossiysk, but Novorossiysk, which is sort of northwest Caucasus, Russian northwest Caucasus, is not big enough to hold all of these ships. So they are sitting ducks, as it were. I mean, the Ukrainians have destroyed a huge number of very expensive Russian naval vessels, including a submarine, even, and the actual repair facilities, the repair docking facilities where these ships were based. So that and they prevented the Russians using that Black Sea fleet to block Ukraine grain exports, which they were doing as well. And so a combination of the Ukrainians demolishing the Black Sea fleet using a variety of means, missiles, the British missiles, French missiles, and other means, Ukrainian ones as well. The first ship which was destroyed was the flagship of the Black Sea fleet, the Moskva and Makarov, and they were destroyed by Ukrainian missiles, so Neptune missiles. So with combination of the Black Sea fleet being out of action and NATO member countries like Bulgaria and Romania allowing Ukraine to sail in their territorial waters along the coast has led to Ukraine resuming, not completely, but a huge amount of its grain exports, and those go to developing countries in Africa and elsewhere. So that's been a big success story, and that's been, I think, quite widely written about in the West, and it will be certainly military academies in NATO countries will be studying that for years to come, because we have a new military environment where a drone or that's costs thousands of pounds can destroy a Russian tank or whatever, which can cost over 100,000.
Yeah, yeah.
And the same with a missile that can cost X amount can destroy ships which costs hundreds of millions, to build. So certainly that's been one of Ukraine's brightest points. But the more Ukrainian forces move south, the more the Black Sea Fleet and its vessels come into target. One of the biggest, I think, shocks to the Russians was the destruction of the Black Sea Fleet headquarters, and they obviously had incredible intelligence, the Ukrainians, because inside intelligence, because they hit it at a time of a meeting of the Black Sea Fleet commanders, and so we don't know how many were killed, but something like 10 to 15 senior officers were killed in that attack.
Yeah. No, intelligence is so important, these things. There was a piece in Time magazine not long ago about sort of President Zelensky, and it was kind of painting a picture of a man who's understandably exhausted. Do you have any insight on how he's sort of doing? And also there's sort of calls from the American right for elections in Ukraine next year. And does that seem realistic and necessary?
No. I mean, according to Ukrainian constitution, Ukrainian law, elections can't be held when you have a state of emergency, and the state of emergency exists when the country's at war. So elections are not simply possible. They're also not possible because there are millions of Ukrainians living abroad who fled last year. So Ireland and Britain both have sort of 150,000 each, for example, Ukrainians. So it's not elections won't take place. I mean, those are just excuses. I think that back in 2019, when there were Ukrainian presidential elections, I was more a supporter of Petro Poroshenko, the incumbent president. And I thought Zelensky was a bit wet behind the ears. He was sort of, he had no political experience. But now, since the invasion, I think Zelensky and not Poroshenko was the right man for the job. I mean, he has shown himself, and he will go into history as Ukraine's Winston Churchill. There's simply no question about that. When the Russians invaded in February 2022, Zelensky did not run away from Kyiv. When Prigozhin launched his coup attempt on Moscow, Putin did run away from Moscow, and he wasn't seen. So he's shown himself to be a leader. The fact that he's frustrated, the fact that he sometimes gets things wrong, and he can be depressed. I mean, come on! Are you surprised? I mean, I'm not. I'm surprised that he can do this a day in, day out. Every day he gives a speech to the Ukrainians, which is, every evening, and he has to keep the morale up of the country. The soldiers on the front line are looking to him, so he can't show his true emotions. And you can see that the cruelties and the war crimes committed by the Russians have an effect on him, as they have an effect on anybody. So I'm not surprised that that this war is going to have a personal impact on him. But I'll say something. I will love to shake the hand of his speechwriter, because his speeches given in different parts of the world have been absolutely superb. And his experience in the field of communications, TV, PR, has worked to Ukraine's benefit. So he's put his foot in it a few times, where I think criticism that he said publicly should have been said behind closed doors. That's how things are done. But come on, give the guy a break.
Indeed.
We would all break. We would all be in that condition, if we were leading a country in this kind of brutal war.
Yeah, indeed. There's a lot of weight on that man's shoulders right now.
There is, yeah.
For the Henry Jackson Society, you've written a new paper titled "Russia and the Anti-Western Axis Must Be Militarily Defeated." Can you talk to us about the anti-Western axis that you identify in the paper and how that relates to the war in Ukraine?
Yeah, this was written before the October 7th Hamas attack on Israel, and then it was that was added to it, as it were. But it wasn't difficult to add to it because it was in the same genre. I think that the West is not united on this war. There are two groups of countries. There are the hawks and the doves. And the hawks are, as I've mentioned, the British, the 4 Scandinavian countries, 3 Baltic countries, Poland, Romania, and the Czech Republic. Those countries openly all say they want Russia's military defeat. And then you have the French, who Macron keeps changing, but the French to a great degree, the Germans, Scholz in particular, and certainly Biden, who have never said that they want Russia's military defeat. And they've just said they want Ukraine not to be defeated. So they've kind of, they don't realize you can't be half pregnant. You're either pregnant or not. And they've got one foot in and one foot out, as it were. Whereas these other more hawkish countries are openly saying Ukraine's military victory, Russia's military defeat. And the reasons for the doves are the kind of things we've already talked about: the fear of nuclear escalation, Russian disintegration. In the case of Scholz, I think it's just because of his left-wing politics, German relations with Russia, fear, that kind of sympathetic ties to Russia. Same probably with France, although, as I say, Macron seems to have changed. France, for the first time now, supports Ukraine's membership of NATO, which was never the case before. So you've got these two groups of countries, and my argument was that the doves should actually align with the hawks, because you're not going to have a consistent Western policy as to how this war should end, unless you come out openly and say that Russia's military defeat is your goal. Because these different fears, I think, are exaggerated. I mean, the fear, for example, of nuclear escalation. Firstly, it was actually the Chinese who played a very positive role here in telling Putin to stop talking about the threat of using nuclear weapons. I mean, I think it was the Americans through the Chinese who got them to do that. It's not in the interests of China that there would be some nuclear kind of conflagration. And military experts like Lawrence Friedman have, when they've dissected this question, they've said that Russia using tactical nuclear weapons on the battlefield would not give it a military advantage. It would also, you can't tell where the radiation is going. So you could kill your troops as much as Ukrainian. And, the state of the Russian army, which is abysmal, they haven't got any uniforms that can be used in the event of using nuclear weapons, specialist specialist uniforms that will be used. So it's not something that's very likely to happen. Russia's disintegration, I think that again is exaggerated. I mean, the Russian Federation is a kind of a mini empire. Ethnic Russians make up about 70% of the population, 30% minorities. There is growing discontent amongst the national minorities for their over-proportional use in the war in Ukraine. There seems to be a lot of Dagestanis, Tatars, Chechens, and other non-Russian minorities from Russia fighting in Ukraine. And I think that's deliberately done by Putin. But the idea that these small entities in Russia, these small autonomous republics, could become independent states is, I think, fanciful. I mean, the worst I think that could happen would be Russia would be returning to its dysfunctional state as it was in the 1990s under Boris Yeltsin. So a kind of a failed state, not a disintegrate. It wouldn't be disintegrating like the Soviet Union. It'd be more like a kind of a very weak central government and a very dysfunctional kind of state as in the 1990s. So I think those are exaggerated. I think in the case of Biden, it's a product that he was part of the Obama team, and Obama was if there's somebody that's betrayed a lot of peoples, it's Obama. The Georgians in 2008, the Syrians in 2012. Does everybody remember Obama's red lines?
Yeah. Unfortunately,
and then the Ukrainians in 2014. What people forget because of their ideological preferences is that Obama vetoed the sending of weapons to Ukraine after 2014. Donald Trump, who I don't like, but Donald Trump did not veto the sending of weapons to Ukraine. Donald Trump imposed sanctions on Nord Stream 2, the German-Russian gas pipeline. Biden, when he came to power in 2020, lifted those sanctions. So Biden comes from that Obama team, which is actually quite moderate. So it's not really, when we're looking at American politics, it's not a question of Democrats, Republicans. There are differences within both parties. I think Bill Clinton would be far more hawkish on this war if he was president than, say, Obama, Biden. So that's the sort of hawks and doves. On the anti-Western axis, I've been joking on Twitter for at least a year that Israeli intelligence must be on extended vacation.
Yeah, and sadly they're paying for it now.
Well, they must be paying for it now. How could you not see this coming, for Christ's sake? The Iranians and the Russians have been military allies since the summer of 2022.
Yeah.
There's no such thing as a free lunch. The Iranians are giving stuff to the Russians, and the Russians are giving stuff to the Iranians. And do they not realize the Russians wouldn't give a damn about actually helping the Iranians to build a nuclear bomb? And so that military cooperation then morphs into a larger one with North Korea. The Chinese are kind of on the sidelines. They're not, I don't think, jumping on the bandwagon yet. I think that they are far more cautious and they're just waiting to see how this pans out. But what we have is, in effect, Russia has completely ditched its very close relationship with Netanyahu, Prime Minister of Israel. There was a very close personal relationship between Putin and Netanyahu, because Netanyahu played to that populist nationalist right. In Europe, he was close to Orban in Hungary, to Trump, and to Putin. And also, the large Russian Jewish community inside Israel was actually very pro-Putin, ironically. I'm not sure if they still are. And so there are posters you can find on the internet from the last Israeli elections where Netanyahu's bragging about being a close buddy with Putin. And that was the reason. That's one of the main reasons why Israel has refused to help Ukraine in this war. Even though Ukraine has a Jewish president, and it has the most successful Jewish revival of any country in Europe. And I've been to these places where this revival has taken place. So Zelensky, that's another reason for him to be very depressed. His family was murdered in the Holocaust in World War II. he survived because his grandfather was in the Soviet army. He wasn't at home when the Nazis came. And to have Israel not support him, even to send, we're not talking about sending military equipment, offensive equipment, but to even not willing to send defensive equipment like the Iron Dome to protect Ukraine from the Russian attack, missile attacks. Netanyahu refused. He was in bed. They ignored this close Russian-Iranian alliance. Now Russia is openly anti-Israeli, openly supporting Iran and Hamas, uses this anti-colonialist rhetoric. It's ridiculous that Russia's pretending it was never an empire. And that it's the West who were the bad guys with their empires. We were never the bad guys. I mean, give me a break.
Well, a lot of that's been a very popular idea on the left, even during the Cold War, that Russia was not an imperial power.
I know, and it just simply doesn't fit the facts. I mean, Putin is using that Soviet legacy of anti-colonialism towards the developing world. But all it really boils down to is anti-Americanism. It's not, pro-Russianism. It's anti-Americanism. How can you explain Jeremy Corbyn being pro-Russian when the Putin's regime is a mafia state? Corbyn's not supporting that. He's doing it because he's anti-American. It's the anti-Americanism which is driving that. So I think what we've got now, whether Netanyahu accepts it or not, is irrelevant, because the buck stops. This biggest intelligence failure since the Yom Kippur War of 1973, the buck stops at Netanyahu, because he's the one who must have been telling the Israeli intelligence service to go on extended vacation. There's no problem with this Iranian-Russian cooperation. Well, there obviously was a problem, what we have is Iran in the case of Israel, Russia in the case of Ukraine. Russia and Iran want to erase two countries from the face of the earth, Israel and Ukraine. This anti-Western axis, that's their goal. They see these two countries, Ukraine and Israel, as interlopers. They shouldn't exist. They're in places where it should be Russian culture identity or Palestinian, Arab, whatever. So it's not a question, again, we're not talking about the creation of two states, Palestinian and Israel. They want to erase Israel from the map. And just as Russia wants to erase Ukraine. So this anti-Western axis is fighting the West on the territory of Ukraine and Israel. To me, it's just blatantly obvious that that's the case. I think that many Western countries find it difficult to accept that, because there are just very, very major conclusions once you accept that. It means that de facto we're at war, and we are at war. The Russians and Iranians and the North Koreans have long thought that they're at war with the West. It's just that we've been going, no, come on, come on, let's be friends. Come on, here's a bit more money, or here's another business deal, or whatever, But that's a reality, and the war in Ukraine has kind of brought that to the front, as it were, that this is a war against the West. The Russians and the Iranians don't even deny it. That they want to destroy the world that was created after 1945 and replace it with this kind of vague multipolar system, which means that there's no international legal order, and autocracies can do what the hell they want. I mean, we'll be living in the jungle. We're back to the jungle. It'll be back to the sort of, I don't know, pre-1914 or interwar era, back to that. And so the war in Ukraine and Israel is existential for both of those countries, on the one hand, because enemies want to erase them, but it's also existential for us in the West. If Ukraine and Israel are defeated, then autocracies have won the day. I mean, I don't see how the West can exist as it has existed since 1945 if there's a defeat. So the anti-Western axis of evil exists, whether we like it or not. And this should bring Israel and Ukraine closer together, hopefully. But probably that would require an election in Israel to get rid of Netanyahu. We shall see how that pans out. But some Israelis are already openly blaming, saying Russia will regret this support for Hamas and Iran.
No, indeed. I think a lot of people underestimate the importance of the war in Ukraine. I've like you've just pretty much said, it's the front line on the war against the West, and I think there's a lot of commentators on the far left and the far right. The far right seem to support Putin because he presents himself as the savior of the white Christian world, and then you've got the far left who are harking back to a rose-tinted view of Russia from the Cold War or something. And I was fascinated by how some of the sort of talking points on the internet over the years that downplay the war in Ukraine are either coming from this sort of far left or far right perspective. I find that really interesting.
I think that the far right is now fractured. I don't think it's as united on this question as it maybe was. I mean, I'm excluding the sort of the white skinhead kind of marginal, but the regular populist nationalist parties are not all pro-Russian as they maybe were 5 years ago. For example, in Scandinavia, where you've got a consensus emerged straight after the invasion of Ukraine in Sweden and Finland for joining NATO, including amongst populist nationalist parties. Poland had a populist nationalist party in power, and they were very pro-Ukrainian, very anti-Russian. Italy, the same. So it depends which part of and in the case of Britain, look, I mean, we had Brexit. Brexit was very dominant in the Conservative Party, but that has not affected Britain's attitude towards this war. It hasn't affected hasn't led to pro-Russianism on the British, at least mainstream right, shall we say?
No.
So I think I would say it's more on the left than on the right. But going back to my earlier point, they have to be more camouflaged today than they were in 2014, because to come out openly now and support Russia, I mean, straight away, people are going to say, what about the war crimes? What about the deportation of children, etc.? This is a legal war, etc., etc. So they had their heyday, certainly in 2014, and I followed them very closely. But now I think they're pretty marginal figures now.
Yeah. What can the West be doing now to help Ukraine? And should Western policymakers be afraid of a military defeat of Russia?
If we think of three scenarios, I mean, three basic scenarios: Russia's military defeat, Ukraine's military defeat, or some kind of in-between situation. Call it frozen, or it's not really frozen, but stalemate kind of situation. I think the only scenarios that are realistic are either Russia's military defeat or stalemate. I just can't see that Russia would have the resources and the manpower to capture the whole of Ukraine. That's still Putin's goal. He hasn't changed his goals at all. But to change the structure of the Russian state, which is a mafia, it's been called a mafia state since at least 2010. Listeners can find the first time Russia was called a mafia country back in 2010 on WikiLeaks. It was an American diplomatic cable. So Russia's been called a mafia state for 13 years. To change that would take, decades. And it's the same with the Russian army. The Russian army is just and the Russian security forces are just a reflection of that mafia state. And you can see that every day on social media, the state of the Russian army in Ukraine. The joke going around Ukraine is that Russia used to be the second best army in the world. Then it became the second best army in Ukraine. And then with Prigozhin's rebellion, it was the second best army in Russia. So that can't change overnight. I mean, it's simply impossible. That means that a Russian military defeat of Ukraine is simply not, I don't think, a realistic scenario. But if we're looking at these other two, the West needs to, or particularly I think in the case of the US, and the Germans change its attitude towards this potential middle ground, the stalemate ground. The Germans have stepped up. They are now the second biggest providers of military equipment to Ukraine. It was the British, and now it's the Germans. I think the British have given quite a lot, but we have a strange situation in Britain that conservative governments in power have actually reduced the power of the British Army. In their time in office, which is not what we think of when we think of conservative governments.
No.
Usually we blame that on the Labour Party.
Yeah.
But it's actually been meant. So I think the British gave a huge amount, and they were like front runners in certain areas like missiles and tanks. But the Germans have taken second place. The Germans are still holding back on one big area, their version of medium-range missiles called the Taurus missile. And I think that's just the fear of Ukraine's using that. Ukraine launches a lot of attacks inside Russia, and I think the Germans are afraid of that being used. But I mean, I'm sure they could do a quiet deal that Ukraine said, we won't use this inside Russia, only in Crimea. What Vladimir Putin is looking and waiting for is the American elections. And I think a lot of people are concerned about a potential Trump victory. I'm a bit cautious, not because I'm a fan of Trump, but because going back to the Trump presidency, he actually was better for Ukraine than Obama.
Really?
And everybody kind of forgets that because they don't like Trump, so they always paint him as this sort of the black, in negative terms. Trump imposed, as I mentioned, Trump imposed sanctions on Nord Stream 2, and he actually did not veto the sending of weapons to Ukraine. And those weapons, they weren't heavy weapons, because Americans, like most Western governments, assumed that Russia would be very quickly able to defeat Ukraine. That was the initial view. But those javelins and stingers, and then the British NLAWs, were crucial at the beginning of the invasion to demolish Russian military columns. But what they're concerned about is the rise of obviously of this populist nationalist wing. I think that I'm a bit more circumvent. I don't think it's going to be so bad, because I think the arguments are so blatantly on continuing supporting Ukraine that those arguments will eventually get through. And there are three kind of big arguments here. Firstly, what we've talked about, the anti-Western axis. You can't, whether you like it or not, separate the conflict with Israel and the conflict with Ukraine now. These are all interconnected now. And hence Biden's attempt to organize military aid to both Israel and Ukraine at the same time. Secondly, there's also a connection to Taiwan, again, whether you like it or not. Another big area important to the Republican right in the US. Weakness by the West in Ukraine sends a signal to other countries, particularly to the Chinese. For example, if the Russians had quickly defeated the Ukrainians, Taiwan would have been under threat. The Chinese have backed off because they were also under the illusions that the West was weak, divided, and unlikely to support Ukraine. And that was the view of both the Chinese and the Russians at the time of the invasion of Ukraine. They were wrong about the West. And hence the Chinese, I think, have backed off from a potential military threat to Taiwan for the time being. But if the West shows weakness in Ukraine, that will send a signal to China that the West won't do anything if it does something against Taiwan. So that's the second point. The third point is that, what is surprising is the Biden administration has been so slow in defending its support for Ukraine. Why? Firstly, this is pittance. What the Americans are sending is a pittance. It's 5% of the American military budget. The Americans have spent 5% of their military budget, have destroyed the Russian army as a real serious military force, without a single American soldier being killed. I mean, how is that not a great investment? Come on. And secondly, and finally, the Biden administration is doing this now. Key American states like Pennsylvania, Nebraska, Arizona, Texas have been getting massive military orders from the U.S. government to make this these shells and this military equipment to send to Ukraine.
Mm.
So it's not as though Biden gives a bag of money to Zelensky.
Yeah.
I mean, that money doesn't go to Ukraine. It goes to producing military equipment, which then goes to Ukraine. So it creates jobs.
Yeah.
It creates, economic upturn in key states. And actually, ironically, many of those states where that U.S. government money is going for that military equipment are states where you have these Trumpite populists voting against Ukrainian aid.
Yeah.
So I think that eventually those arguments will come across, and I don't think it's going to be as bad as another final factor, which is something that's not talked about enough, is that the EU has actually stepped forward in an incredible way.
Yeah.
The EU now provides far more financial economic aid to Ukraine than the US. And we shouldn't just focus on the military side, because Ukraine government, to pay things like social welfare, pensions, state wages for state officials, needs about $5 billion a month. That's been funded by the West, primarily by the EU. So the EU has come up. The EU is also, for the first time in its history, giving military orders to countries to produce shells and other military equipment to send to Ukraine. The EU isn't providing as much military aid as the US, but it's certainly growing. And that's good. I mean, because remember, the arguments were always on by the Americans, the Europeans are always lagging. They're never providing enough support for NATO. They're always, behind. Germany, for the first time now, is going to be spending more than 2% of GDP on defense, which has been a NATO requirement for a long time. So I think that all of those areas, I'm not that pessimistic, but certainly we're in this kind of winter lull where hardcore military activity probably won't take place. It'll be more this hybrid war, assassinations, drone attacks, missile attacks. This kind of activity will take more. But let's keep a continuing watch on the Ukrainian bridgehead on the Dnipro River, because if that, as it does seem to be, expands, the Russians are dangerously open to being surrounded.
Yeah. One last question. Since we last spoke, there's been quite a few dramatic incidents in Russia. We've had that failed mutiny by Prigozhin, and then his dramatic death about a month later, and things were looking quite dicey for Putin. So what is his position like at the moment? Is he as in control as he appears, or do you think we may see another challenge to his power?
The Prigozhin mutiny, or whatever you want, coup, or whatever you want to call it, was, I think, experts are still trying to dissect it and trying to understand it. Because why did he suddenly stop as he was driving to Moscow? It was basically an open road. It was hilarious to see how so many Russian military commanders and commanders of the National Guard, which are supposed to deal with internal dissent, suddenly checked themselves into clinics with illnesses. Because they didn't, this is a typical kind of Soviet approach. Same thing happened in August 91 when there was a coup. That what they do is they wait on the sidelines to see who wins, and then they join the victors.
Yeah,
that must be a terrible sign to Putin that they didn't rush to support him. They didn't rush to help him. It's a very mixed picture. I mean, opinion polls and surveys show that most Russians continue to support the war, but within that support, what we have, say, for example, 70% support. What we have within that is 20% hardcore nationalist support and 50% of this kind of wavering. So, for example, if there was another rebellion like Prigozhin, as we saw when Prigozhin took over the Rostov-on-Don and a few other Russian cities, people came out on the streets and cheered them. They didn't cheer the soldiers trying to attack Prigozhin. So it's very soft support. So that doesn't look good for Putin's regime. It's a very brittle kind of regime in that sense. In terms of how strong is his regime, it's very difficult to say. I think that his big concern is to get through the March 24 presidential elections. Of course, he's going to win them. There's no question about that. And what he doesn't want, and I think this is a wasted opportunity in the part of the West, what he doesn't want is some major military defeat before that. And I'm sure the Ukrainians are thinking up, particularly the Ukrainian intelligence services are thinking up various ways that they can screw up those Russian elections.
Yes.
Some nice surprises. For example, major attacks on the Russian bridge between Kerch and Crimea.
Yeah.
So we'll see on that. It is rather surprising, and you would think there would be eventually a tipping point of how many Russian soldiers are dying. I mean, we're talking about in that Avdiivka, Donetsk area. The British Ministry of Defense Intelligence just a few days ago has been talking about the highest ever recorded deaths in a day of 1,000 a day.
Yeah.
I mean, these are huge numbers.
That is huge.
And it's bizarre to watch on social media often Russian soldiers complaining. Their officers treat them like muck, like something you wipe off your shoe. They don't have enough equipment. They're not treated well in terms of food supplies and others. They're sent in as what they call them meat waves or cannon fodder waves, just sent in, as it were, without any bothering about how many of them get killed. And yet they're still willing to do that. I think that eventually there's going to be a tipping point where they're going to say, no, this has gone too far. And we are already talking about 300,000 killed and wounded, 300,000 casualties in less than 2 years.
Yeah.
Western governments, including the British Ministry of Defense, always thought the Ukrainians were exaggerating, but they've now caught up with they believe the Ukrainian estimates now. That's a huge number. To compare, in Afghanistan, which was a war the Soviet Union was in for 10 years, they had 50,000 casualties, deaths and wounded. 50,000 over 10 years. This is 300,000 in less than 2 years.
Yeah.
You would think that eventually there will be a point where Russians will say enough. When that point happens, who knows?
It's reminiscent of World War I, isn't it? And the invention of the machine gun and people still charging of horses.
Yes. Yeah. And or the charging on horseback towards tanks and stuff. Yeah.
It's crazy.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for all your insight today. Where can listeners sort of find out more about you and your work?
I think the best way is just search for my name under Google. You'll find all the articles that I've written there. And they can always contact me if need be through the podcast as well if they want something specifically. Often, for example, academic articles which have to be downloaded from libraries. I can help with that as well.
Thank you for joining me today. It's been great chatting with you.
Thank you for inviting me. It's been great.
Thanks for listening. This is Secrets and Spies.